There are some names in history that don't just belong to a person, they belong to the world. Charlie Chaplin was one of them. His bowler hat, tiny mustache, and mismatched coat were instantly recognizable in every corner of the globe. Children laughed at his physical comedy, adults admired the intelligence behind his humor, and entire nations found relief in his silent films during times of war, poverty, and hardship. His character the Tramp wasn't simply a fictional figure, he was a mirror to the world's suffering and hope. Behind his comedy was a gentle plea: be kind, be human, be better. But as millions adored him, another set of eyes watched him quietly, cautiously, and relentlessly. Not fans, not critics, but the FBI. The story of Charlie Chaplin is not just a story of success. It is a story of suspicion, misunderstanding, and quiet fear. At first glance, Chaplin seemed harmless, a comedian, performer, a filmmaker. But to those in power during the tense political climate of the mid-20th century, Chaplin's influence was far greater than entertainment. He wasn't merely making films, he was shaping minds, inspiring empathy, challenging systems, and giving a voice to those society often ignored. And in a time where governments feared ideas more than weapons, that made him dangerous. Born into poverty in London, Chaplin's early life was anything but glamorous. His childhood was filled with hardship, hunger, and instability. His father died when he was young, and his mother battled mental illness, leaving Chaplin and his brother to survive largely on their own. This pain, raw and unforgettable, shaped every film Chaplin would later create. His characters weren't polished or powerful, they were poor, overlooked, and underestimated, yet full of dignity, humor, and heart. His comedy wasn't meant to make fun of people, it was meant to lift them. Every laugh had a message, every tear had a purpose, and every story carried a quiet rebellion against injustice. As Chaplin's fame grew in Hollywood, he remained outspoken, especially about war, greed, and inequality. His films began to carry deeper social themes. The Great Dictator, released in 1940, was one of the boldest acts of courage in film history. While most studios avoided political conflict during the rise of fascism, Chaplin stood before the world and openly mocked tyranny. His closing speech, emotional, terror-filled, and unforgettable, wasn't just dialogue. It was a plea for humanity, a call for peace, a warning. Millions applauded him, but others took notes. In the United States, the political environment during the 1940 seconds and 1950 seconds was shifting. Fear of communism spread rapidly, and government agencies became increasingly suspicious of artists, activists, and intellectuals. Influence was power, and Chaplin had more influence than almost any entertainer alive. His films crossed borders, languages, and cultures. His words resonated deeply with working-class people, and in a time when national identity felt threatened, some officials saw Chaplin not as a beloved entertainer, but as a potential ideological threat. Quietly, without his knowledge, a file began forming. At first it was thin, a few pages of observations, but as Chaplin spoke more publicly about humanitarian ideals, social responsibility, and peace, the file expanded. Reports, interview transcripts, travelogues, newspaper clippings, public speeches, every piece of information collected and stored in a drawer labeled with his name, Charlie Chaplin. The American public continued to adore him. Children waited for his films, families gathered in theaters, and critics hailed him a genius. But behind closed doors at the FBI, led by director J. Edgar Hoover, the tone was very different. Chaplin was not seen as harmless. He was seen as unpredictable, an entertainer with influence beyond Hollywood, someone whose art could fuel national conversations that those in power were not ready to confront. Chaplin's personal life also came under scrutiny. His relationships, his friendships, his political connections, all examined, all questioned, and often misunderstood. When Chaplin refused to become a U.S. citizen, insisting he was a citizen of the world, suspicion deepened. To some, those words demonstrated compassion. To others, they hinted at disloyalty. As the Cold War intensified, Chaplin's name appeared on lists alongside writers, scientists, directors, and musicians individuals. The government, labeled as politically sensitive, his FBI file grew thicker each year, accumulating statements, rumors, opinions, and theories. Some were factual, many were hearsay, but together, they formed one of the most extensive surveillance files ever compiled on an entertainer. Still, Chaplin continued making films. Still, he made people laugh. Still, he spoke about kindness and equality. And still, the world adored him. But a storm was forming. One he could not see. One he could not stop. Public campaigns began questioning his patriotism. Headlines turned from admiration to accusation. The government's quiet suspicion slowly became a national conversation. Chaplin, the man who devoted his craft to uplifting humanity, now found himself facing a world uncertain of his character, not because of crimes or wrongdoing, but because his ideas challenged the boundaries of comfort and control. As the pressure intensified, Chaplin found himself at a crossroads: defend himself publicly, stay silent and hope the storm passed, or continue creating art and trust that history would understand him better than his own era. And then, unexpectedly, the moment arrived, a turning point that would change everything. Because one day, while traveling overseas, Charlie Chaplin received a message from the United States government, a message that would alter the course of his life. A message that said, "You are not allowed to return." The year was 1952, and Charlie Chaplin boarded a ship with his family, believing he was simply traveling to London for the premiere of his new film, Limelight. He packed for events, for applause, for celebration, not knowing that this trip would become a one-way journey. As the ship drifted away from the American coastline, Chaplin stood on the deck watching the horizon. Perhaps he felt excitement, perhaps nostalgia, perhaps nothing at all. The future still seemed open. Then, somewhere over the Atlantic, the message arrived. The United States government had officially revoked his re-entry permit. A nation that once embraced him now turned its back. The land where he built his career, where he raised his children, where millions laughed and cried with his films, now saw him as unwelcome. To Chaplin, it must have felt surreal. How could a clown become a threat? How could laughter become feared? He didn't shout. He didn't protest immediately. Instead, he sat silently, absorbing the reality settling around him. He had survived poverty, loneliness, and abandonment as a child. But this moment, being shut out from a country he helped entertain for decades, cut deeper than almost any wound before. The newspapers back home exploded with headlines. Some celebrated the decision, calling him subversive. Others were stunned, heartbroken, confused. Famous film critics called it an injustice. Fans wrote letters demanding explanations. But the machinery of suspicion had already done its work. Chaplin settled in Vevey, Switzerland, in a large house overlooking the mountains and calm water, a place far from Hollywood, far from controversy, and far from the agency that had watched him from the shadows. Yet even there, the world did not forget him. Cameras still followed him, governments still discussed him, his films still played, and somewhere inside the FBI, his file continued to grow. But now, those reports carried a tone of victory, as if the government believed that forcing Chaplin out meant forcing his influence out as well. They were wrong. Though physically distant, Chaplin's work remained deeply rooted in public consciousness. His earlier films became even more treasured. Young filmmakers studied his craft. Audiences around the world rediscovered his silent masterpieces and found that his messages were timeless. The poor still needed compassion. The powerful still needed accountability. Humanity still needed laughter. Still, being in exile was not easy. Chaplin struggled emotionally with the rejection from a country he once considered home. Friends who once stood proudly beside him fell silent, not necessarily out of betrayal, but out of fear. The climate of suspicion in America made association risky. Yet, despite heartbreak, Chaplin did not become bitter. Instead, he continued creating slowly, quietly, deliberately. Years passed, and the political landscape shifted. Generations grew up, the world changed, and time, as it often does, softened perspectives. By the late 1960s, something unexpected happened. The world rediscovered Chaplin with a fresh, admiring gaze. His films were re-released, festivals honored him, and young audiences embraced him as if discovering a treasure their grandparents had buried and forgotten to mention. The movement grew into something powerful, a global wave of appreciation, forgiveness, and recognition. And eventually, the United States, the very country that once pushed him away, asked him to return. It was 1972, 20 long years after Chaplin had left. He was invited to receive an honorary Academy Award not just for acting, but for shaping the language of cinema itself. The invitation was emotional, symbolic, and historic. Chaplin hesitated. How could he return to a place that had exiled him? But deep inside, perhaps he understood something profound. Sometimes, reconciliation is not about forgetting the past, but acknowledging its pain and walking through it anyway. So at age 82, Charlie Chaplin stepped once again onto American soil. When he entered the Academy Awards ceremony, the audience rose in what became one of the longest standing ovations in Oscar history. People clapped until their hands hurt. Some cried. Others simply smiled and whispered, "He's back." Chaplin stood there quietly, humbled, overwhelmed. His eyes glistened, not with arrogance, but with emotion. The man who had once made millions laugh now struggled to speak. Through the intensity of that moment, when he finally addressed the audience, his voice was soft and filled with gratitude. "Thank you for the honor," he said. "It means so much to me." But what he likely felt deep underneath was not just gratitude, it was closure. The FBI files remained classified for decades, locked away, sealed, reserved for a future generation that would one day ask, why? And when those files were eventually released, the world learned the truth. Charlie Chaplin hadn't been exiled because of crimes or threats. He had been watched because of his ideas, because he believed the world should be fair, because he believed laughter could change people, because he believed humanity deserved compassion. And to some in power, that was far more intimidating than silence. Chaplin lived the rest of his life in peace in Switzerland, surrounded by family and memory. He passed away quietly in 1977, leaving behind a world forever changed by his art. But even after his death, the story wasn't over. Because as the files were uncovered, as researchers analyzed the hundreds of pages of surveillance, and as historians reflected on the era, one realization became clear. Chaplin wasn't just a man the world laughed with. He was a man some feared because he reminded society of its conscience. The final chapter of Charlie Chaplin's life unfolded far from the cameras, controversy, and bright lights of Hollywood. In his quiet Swiss estate, surrounded by mountains and soft mist, Chaplin entered a phase of life marked by reflection rather than performance. There were moments when he would sit by the window, listening to the rustle of trees and the distant laughter of his children. And in those moments, it was impossible not to imagine him looking back on everything he had lived through. His journey had not just been about films, comedy, or fame. It had been about challenging the world to feel, to think, and to recognize the humanity in everyone. He had known rejection, praise, suspicion, admiration, and silence. He had entertained millions and unsettled governments. He had been celebrated as a genius and labeled as a threat. Yet in these peaceful later years, none of those labels seemed to matter anymore. What mattered most was that he had remained true to himself. Decades later, when the classified FBI files finally began to surface, the world discovered just how closely the government had observed him. Page after page revealed surveillance reports, interviews, travel logs, and speculations documented over many years. Some entries came from witnesses who barely knew him, others from informants offering opinions rather than evidence. The deeper historians studied the documents, the clearer one truth became. Nothing in those pages ever proved illegal activity or wrongdoing. What the documents revealed instead was a nation's fear not of Chaplin himself, but of what he represented: a voice that crossed borders and inspired compassion. In a tense political era, influence, even when rooted in kindness, was considered unpredictable, and unpredictability was something powerful institutions feared. While the truth behind the surveillance finally came to light long after Chaplin had left the world, its release shifted the public's understanding of him. The narrative changed from suspicion to admiration, from controversy to legacy, from a figure questioned by his era to one honored by history. Over time, Chaplin's films experienced a renaissance. They were restored, re-released, and studied around the world. Universities analyzed them. Museums displayed artifacts from his career. Younger generations born long after his final performance discovered his work with fresh eyes and open hearts, laughing at his comedy and recognizing the emotional truth behind it. The world slowly learned what millions already knew. Chaplin was not just a performer. He was a storyteller, with the rare ability to unite hearts, without ever speaking a single word. On Christmas Day in 1977, Charlie Chaplin passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 88. News of his death spread across continents, and tributes emerged from film critics, world leaders, fellow entertainers, and ordinary fans who had grown up watching his films. People didn't just mourn the loss of an artist, they mourned a part of humanity, that rare soul who could make the world laugh even when reality felt heavy. It is said that during his funeral, silence lingered longer than expected, as if the world needed extra time to understand the weight of the moment. The man who once fell, stumbled, and tumbled on screen with perfect comedic timing, had walked his final step. Yet even after his passing, Chaplin's story did not fade. His films continued to reach hearts, his speeches continued to inspire, and his philosophy that laughter can make life more bearable remained timeless. The legacy he left behind was not defined by controversy or surveillance or suspicion. It was defined by the kindness, humility, and humanity woven into his characters. Today, when audiences watch Modern Times, City Lights, or The Kid, they do not see someone dangerous or political. They see a man who understood the silent ache of the human condition and responded to it with gentleness. They see a reminder that no matter how fast the world moves, we must never lose empathy, never stop laughing, and never forget the power of compassion. In the end, the most profound truth about Charlie Chaplin is simple. The world tried to watch him, judge him, and define him, yet he remained larger than every attempt to contain him, because his real power was never in his politics, his statements, or even his fame. It was in the connection he created with millions of strangers who saw themselves in his characters. And so today, long after the investigations have ended and the files have gathered dust, Charlie Chaplin continues to shine not as a man who was feared, but as a man who made humanity feel seen. His laughter outlived the questions, his heart outlasted the suspicion, and his art, forever timeless, continues to whisper softly to us all, be gentle, be kind, and never forget to smile, even when the world feels heavy.